So when we started planning this conference 9 months ago, I guess, when we first started discussions, and our friends with the Reagan Building agreed to partner with us and be an early supporter of the conference, there were a number of topics we wanted to talk about. We weren't sure at that time what was going to happen with USMCA, but I think we had a really good idea that China was going to remain front and center and that this topic was going to be one that we were going to have to address early on in the conference and bring together a top-notch panel. Really delighted to have the speakers we have here today, a couple of whom we haven't had here at WITA before, so we're really pleased to have some new voices. But a voice that we've had several times and is a great friend, supporter, partner, someone we greatly respect and really appreciate is Darci Vetter, Ambassador Darci Vetter, who's a good friend of WITA, has participated in various discussions over the years, and we're very grateful to her. She'll moderate this discussion, similar format to the last one. We'll have a discussion among the panelists and have some time for questions at the end, and then we will be able to have lunch. So with that, I'll turn it over to Darci.
Thank you very much, Ken, and thanks to all of you for being here today and to our panelists. I think the title is particularly apt for this panel. In a trade war with China, what does victory look like? Isn't that the $300 billion question, or maybe even more? And I suspect if I went around the room and took a poll, there would be a lot of different answers to that question, even in a room full of self-described trade nerds who think of through that lens an awful lot. But I do think we have to remember that the trade and economic relationship with China is critically important, but we have a number of other things on our plate with China as well. National security questions, North Korea, even a climate change agenda where we are inextricably linked with what happens in China. And that I'm very pleased to have on the stage with me some people who think about trade with China a lot, but think about the overall global economic relationship and our overall political relationship with China too. And so I hope to explore a little bit not only what we think a good outcome would be in a trade war with China, but are we asking all of the right questions? Are we using our trade discussions and integrating those goals we have for trade and economic issues with larger discussions about the role we see for the U.S. and China in the world on other issues as well? And should we be integrating those discussions? Is it possible or desirable to sort of keep those issues on a separate track as some of the other things we're working with China on? And so I hope we can have a really healthy discussion about a number of the things we have on our table. And of course, we happen to be here at some pretty interesting timing for just those questions. We are here the day after the Department of Justice announced 2 indictments on Huawei, one for stealing trade secrets and another for violating our sanctions on North Korea. And the day before, we kick off another round of trade discussions chaired by Ambassador Lighthizer and Liu He from China. So there really couldn't be a better time to be asking ourselves, again, what does that victory look like for trade and for our greater relationship? And I am extremely pleased to be joined by David Dollar, the Brookings Institution, Bonnie Glaser from CSIS, and David Goldman, an economist and columnist for the Asia Times, to help us explore that. I'm going to ask each of our panelists to talk for about 5 minutes. What does that victory look like? And then we will move into some questions and then open up to the audience. So without further ado, David.
Okay, thank you very much. Great pleasure to be here. So I'm going to focus on the narrow question of what victory looks like in the immediate trade war, recognizing that the other issues are important too, and we'll get to those. But to me, victory in the trade conflict with China would have 4 components. The most important is market access. China has relatively low overall import tariff rates, but it has some specific sectors where import tariffs are fairly high. It has some non-tariff barriers. And to me, even more important, it has a lot of restrictions on investment. Among the G20 countries, China is the most restrictive in terms of inward investment. There are some sectors where firms can have 100% foreign-owned operations, but there are many sectors where foreign firms cannot. And in my view, this is what leads to the issues of forced technology transfer and prevents American and other foreign firms from having the full benefit of access to the Chinese market. So the most important thing I'm going to be looking for is some real progress on market access. They've made some commitments on automobiles, but they're years in the future, so they could accelerate that and do that more quickly. There's financial services. I'm a big fan of opening up healthcare, which could potentially be a big market. So I'm looking for a specific market opening. To me, that's the most important thing. Second, there are other important structural issues like intellectual property rights and state enterprises. And realistically, China is not going to change their whole system overnight. So the question is, are there some down payments? Can they strengthen penalties on intellectual property rights violations? They've made a lot of progress on IPR protection, and so we can reasonably expect more progress. President Obama and President Xi reached an agreement on no government cyber theft of commercial secrets that are then turned over to enterprises. That seemed to last for a year or more, but recently, reportedly, you have these kind of cyber attacks. So you've got some specific issues. State enterprises is going to be difficult. The last panel pointed out that the TPP had lots of nice provisions. It didn't mention the state enterprise chapter. That would be a good example of what we might try to do with China. So progress on the structural issues, but recognizing they're not going to change their system overnight. Now, the third component of an agreement will almost certainly be some big purchases. To me, this is totally unimportant. Okay, I mean, whether China buys its soybeans from the United States or from Brazil, these are tradable commodities. We could end up selling a lot of natural gas to China. That's nice, but it's actually not going to really change anything. If we don't sell it to China, we're going to sell it to South Korea or Japan. So I see that mostly as a shell game and basically PR. And I relate that to this mistaken effort to try to change the bilateral trade balance between the U.S. and China. In my view, that's just not very important. It's also not a smart political goal because the trade imbalance is almost certainly going to be going up. We've stimulated our economy late in the cycle, so our trade deficit is going up with Europe. It's going up with the NAFTA partners we talked to in the last session. It's going up with everybody. So aspiring to bring that down, unless we make our own macroeconomic adjustments, that's not realistic. And then just very briefly, fourth point, what I'm looking for in a victory is that we stop shooting ourselves in the foot. The CBO just came out with an estimate about how our own tariffs are slowing down the U.S. economy because a lot of what we import are parts and components. And when we interfere with those value chains, we slow down. We make our economy less productive. We also hurt consumers. So I'm hoping we get a trade deal that has some of those elements I mentioned, and that we then pull back on the tariffs, which means we would stop shooting ourselves in the foot. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Very clear. I think a very good list. I saw a lot of heads nodding on some of those items in the audience. Can I do one quick follow-up with you and ask about timing? Because I think that you noted there are some things they can do immediately and are probably tempting, like making some big purchases, but some of those reforms are likely to take a little bit longer. What is your sort of prediction or maybe your advice about how we set up a process that's robust, but that helps to manage the differences between what can be done immediately and what might take some time?
Right. So most of the things I mentioned, in some sense, would be commitments. Even if they say they're willing to open up autos on January 1st or maybe June 30th, for example, it's almost inevitably going to be a few months in the future. Right. And then the structural things, even more so if they say they'll increase penalties for IPR violations or if they pledge to stop the cyber theft, it's going to take some months to ascertain whether or not they're actually following through. I think the administration is putting a lot of emphasis on, implementation and accountability. I have to be fair to previous administrations, of course, in the Bush administration, the Obama administration. There were always complicated follow-up mechanisms. Every 6 months, we would sit down with the Chinese and review progress. So, we've had that. You could be cynical and say, we've had that and it hasn't seemed to generate radical change.
Yeah, I think I can say from experience that follow-up on the process-based commitments was always sort of hard to ascertain. And so those benchmarks on the timing, I think, will certainly be important, but they are difficult. So, Bonnie, if I could turn to you, what do you think victory in the trade war looks like?
Well, thank you, Darci, for having me on this panel today. I'm going to take this conversation up to maybe 30,000 feet. As for those of you who know me, I'm not a trade expert. I am a security nerd. And I look at trade in the context of the broader U.S.-China relationship. So what victory looks like in the broader relationship is, I think, something that we have to think about, and we have to think about what the problems are in the relationship. And I promise you I will be provocative. I started my career when the Soviet Union still existed, and the glue of the U.S.-China relationship was very much our sort of anti-Soviet cooperation. And when that evaporated, we moved gradually to having our economic ties become the ballast of our bilateral relationship. The Chinese have fought hard to preserve that because they want to have, for many reasons, a good relationship with the United States. But I believe that those days are gone. I do not know whether we can restore them. Not only are economic ties not a positive factor in the U.S.-China relationship, they are really widely seen as a negative factor. So the economic relationship is seen by many, certainly by many in this administration, as harmful, not only to our economic interests, but also to American security interests. And I think that this is a fundamental shift, and I believe it will endure beyond the Trump presidency. I think we'll be living with this for some time. So the souring of the economic relationship has taken place slowly, but I think that there is an emerging consensus in the U.S. that China's economic model and its policies are problematic and that they have to change if we are going to have a sustainable relationship, not just in the economic and trade realm, but overall. In the area that I focus on, in the security realm, the list of problems is really quite long. We've had problems in the security realm even before we started focusing on our problems in the economic and trade realm. I would say, in fact, the business community has been sort of slow to come to the realization and willingness to say that there are problems with China in the security realm. We have been seeing this since really the mid to late 90s, and then rapidly building, where we've seen China develop military capabilities and what's called, for anti-access area denial purposes, to put at risk American assets that could be deployed in the region, make it difficult for us to, or costly, to defend our allies. Everybody knows about the military bases that have been built on artificial islands in the South China Sea. China is assiduously working to weaken our alliances and undermine U.S. presence in the region, and I can give you many concrete examples of that. And the Chinese are using cyber operations for traditional espionage purposes, of course, but also for stealing intellectual property and trade secrets, as David mentioned, despite our agreement in 2015 under the Obama administration. So China's pursuit of its economic and security interests are increasingly being seen as inimical to the liberal international order. And we need to be clear what some of the things that Xi Jinping has said very publicly about leading global governance reform and making adjustments to that international order. There are increasingly indications that China poses not only a challenge to norms and values around the world that underpin this order, but also ideological challenges as well. So the trade talks, as you mentioned, between the U.S. and China will resume tomorrow. Beijing, of course, is offered to buy more American products. Gradually, I think, would be willing to allow more access to its markets. But I doubt that China will agree to measures that will reduce its reliance on a state-led industrial policy, which we fundamentally find troubling. I doubt it will eliminate subsidies to its SOEs or really provide a truly level playing field to foreign companies. The Chinese may have stopped talking about Made in China 2025, but I doubt China has abandoned the plan, and it certainly is aimed at making China a dominant player in 10 strategic industries. Again, not only economic implications, but also security. So the questions we all have to ask is where we have shared interests with China. I think this administration is spending a lot of time focusing on the competition, not looking at some of the potential for cooperation. You mentioned climate change, not a priority for this administration, but maybe we'll get back to that. There is a little bit of attention being paid to fentanyl, so it's not all about competition. There should be more emphasis on cooperation. But I think that it isn't surprising to me where we are at this juncture, that the U.S.-China relationship is at best adrift, and at worst it is heading in an adversarial direction. And I think the outcome of these talks will matter, but maybe on the margins, because there's many, many issues that we have to deal with China.
Thank you for that, and agreed. It was provocative, certainly thought-provoking. I want to follow up on one of the things that you said about China very purposefully looking to weaken our alliances with other countries, including some of our allies. And what would you say that our current trade agenda, both the trade war or trade policies with China, but also some of our trade actions with other countries, are doing in that vein? Are we, in fact, making it easier for China to pick off some of those alliances or to weaken them?
There's many things that the U.S. is doing. Trade area is one of them. Other things that we are doing with our allies, such as the burden-sharing negotiations with South Korea, that I think are creating openings for China. So I definitely agree. The fact that we are relying on tariffs, for example, has really alienated many of our allies and emerging partners around the world. So I think there is a widely held view, at least outside the administration, probably within and among the bureaucracy, that if we are going to deal with the challenges that China poses, that we really can't be effective ourselves. Unilateral policies probably will not work. And the really interesting thing is that there's now much more concern about Chinese policies, both security and economic policies, around the world. Whether you look at Australia or Germany or Canada, many of our friends and allies around the world are concerned about China and would like to work with us on things like WTO reform. Whereas the administration now seems to be much more focused on going it alone, and I think that will make it very difficult for us to be effective.
I think that's a little bit of a double-edged sword. I think this administration does, frankly, deserve some credit for very clearly stating and identifying and pushing against the problems.
Yes.
But where they have unified attention, then we have to figure out how to use that energy in a unified way. That's very well said. David, what are your thoughts? What do you think the victory looks like in this trade war?
That's sort of a trick question for reasons I think David and Bonnie eloquently described. It's a privilege to follow them. From the Chinese standpoint, I have had extensive discussions with Chinese officials, my colleagues at Asia Times have. What you'll hear from senior Chinese officials is, who cares about China 2025? That was an internal marketing slogan. Of course we'll get rid of it. We care about 2035 because in our long-term view at that point we'll be by far the largest economy in the world. Nobody will be able to push us around. We just got to about 10,000 per capita GDP, 30 times where we were when Deng Xiaoping started out, and we don't want to disrupt things. So we'll give the Americans whatever they ask for. If you want us to buy more soybeans, we'll do it. We'll open up the market, just as David was saying. Allianz Insurance has already got the first full insurance license. They're going to set up a PIMCO-style money manager. The German auto companies already have more than 50% JVs. So the gates are opening to investment. What you tell us what you want, and we'll do it. The one thing, as Bonnie said, the Chinese can't possibly do is change their spots. I think we have a very old problem with the new dimension. I don't believe there is a Chinese model per se. There's an Asian model. It began with the Meiji Restoration and Japan's rapid industrialization, became the Singapore model, the Japanese post-war model. Deng Xiaoping learned it from Lee Kuan Yew, and it's a model which treats heavy capital equipment in industry the way we think of a bridge or an airport. It's something to be subsidized as a public good. The difference is we now have a country of 1.4 billion people using this model, so the gravitational effect of Chinese industrial policy is just staggering. Take the following paradox. Huawei now owns the 5G market, pretty much. No one can really compete with them. Ericsson and Nokia are way behind. And there's a panic in the national security establishment about this, and you're seeing the sort of things that national security establishments do to justify past mistakes and sloth. In other words, have a public tantrum. If you don't believe me, go to YouTube and look up T-Mobile Tappy the Robot and look at the technology that China is supposed to have stolen from T-Mobile. We're into deep silly on many of these things. But they did this with $20 billion a year, which is 4 times what either Ericsson and Nokia spend. It's more than Microsoft spends. But Cisco, which used to own the market for telecom equipment and the internet, has a cash hoard of $70 billion. Why doesn't Cisco use that money to stifle Huawei in the cradle? They could have easily, and the answer is because you have a subsidized capital investment regime in Asia, Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, and China, and they simply don't know any other way to do things. So if we insist on eliminating this, and we try to use tariffs to do it, then we'll probably have a collapse of world trade, another stock market crash, all the negative effects that David Dollar was referring to. The administration has learned that there are losses to be had, and they don't want this. So I think what we'll get as a short-term solution is the kind of deal the Chinese are prepared to offer. That leaves us with a long-term problem and a set of very unpleasant choices. Going back to the Cold War, per Bonnie's point, we didn't have an industrial policy, but we had a technology policy. We spent nearly 1.5 points of GDP on military and aerospace R&D, and DARPA worked hand in glove with great corporate laboratories at Bell, GE, RCA, and so forth. And every technology that came out of the digital age, without exception, came from government-private sector collaboration, government funding of basic research, private risk-taking to commercialize. Virtually all of that is now produced in Asia because the Asian model is better at funding a $20 billion fab plant than the United States is. So my view is, as a suggestion, that we fight this like the Cold War. We go back to that model of an aggressive technology policy. We don't have a U.S. company that can provide 5G equipment. That's a scandal. It's a game-changing technology. It's not too late to get back into the game. Simply beating up the Chinese for being ahead of us is not going to be an effective policy. So I see a two-stage thing. I see a deal along the lines that David was discussing, which is not good for us, but it's not damaging for us. An attempt to fix the problem with tariffs would make things worse in the short term, and that leaves us with a great deal of work in front of us to deal with the problems that Bonnie was describing.
So very interesting, thank you, and your thoughts on the fact that we need perhaps not just a negotiating response, but a domestic response about our positioning in the global economy and vis-a-vis China. How do we turn this discussion? I mean, I've always felt like at the beginning of this administration, there was actually an opportunity maybe to focus on those who were left behind sometimes in the global economy and the trade debate, about a skills deficit, about gearing our economy to be better able to compete. Where do we kind of reach in and find the energy to have that discussion, as well as a discussion that I think is somewhat easier politically, sort of us against China, rather than investing in ourselves?
Well, the Chinese are boiling us like the proverbial frog. We haven't had a Sputnik moment, a moment where we say, we're behind, we need massive investment in STEM education, we need massive R&D budget, we have to have government corporate cooperation to do all these things, we need to get to the moon. When you listen to President Kennedy's speech at Rice University in, I think, 1961, I wish President Trump would make a speech like that. There are many dimensions to it, but I think the first thing is we need the national humility to recognize that we've fallen behind, and we need the national will to do whatever it takes to get ahead again.
Do you think there is the will to spend the kind of money or to invest as a country in what it takes to do that?
Well, no. We have the money, but as Bonnie said, our assets are in danger. We don't, it might be more important to spend more money on hypersonic missiles and their defense and other frontier technology issues than to build another aircraft carrier. But admirals like aircraft carriers because that's how you get promoted, by skipping an aircraft carrier. The military will always want more of the things it's had in the past. So I don't believe the president has been well advised on these things. I don't think he has the background or full information to look at this. I would have liked someone like Michael Griffin, who's the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering, to take the top slot. I think he's a visionary with a very clear idea of what to do. So there are people out there, and there's plenty of congressional testimony, plenty of articles outlining what one might do. I claim no originality in this field. It's a question of, do we have the will? At the moment, we don't, but I hope we'll get it.
Excellent. So, a couple of questions circling back here. You outlined, I think, David, very clearly what you think a package might look like. Some sort of immediate gains, some sort of a down payment or a process moving forward. I've been struck by the conversation about China and with China thus far, that the strategy and the tactics from the United States have very effectively sort of focused on China's shortcomings, on using tariffs and other things to try and get maximum leverage and to really be out there with U.S. demands. But what's in it for China? How do we structure this in a way that looks like it's politically palatable, that it's both sides kind of moving together, that there's an option for them to save face, that this is a process that's on track?
Okay, very good question. So the Chinese economy was already slowing down before the trade war started, mostly because of their own policy. They'd had a big credit boom, they'd overdone it, and basically they needed to slow down the growth of credit and investment, and they were making good progress. Trade war comes on top of that, really complicates their situation. So their economy is decelerating certainly more than they want. Their stock market declined about maybe 25% last year. Not terribly important, but a signal they're fighting some risk of capital outflows. So the economic situation is difficult. I think China has a very strong incentive to make a deal. And some of the things I mentioned, I think, are clearly in China's interest. They already have many sectors that are fully open. That's where a lot of their dynamism comes from. It's ironic we talk about state enterprises, which is certainly a problem, but none of their export success comes from state enterprises. It comes from foreign invested firms, and then they've now built these very strong backward linkages to the domestic private sector. So most of the value added in China's exports comes from their domestic private sector. So if they open up more sectors, they're going to get more foreign investment, they're going to get more dynamic linkages to their private sector. That's their model that really worked for them in the past, and I don't see any reason why they can't get back into that. Now, we did all touch on some of the more difficult issues. Politically, they need to hang on to state enterprises. I don't think it helps them very much economically, but politically, Xi Jinping seems to be committed to that. I like, if I could just quickly comment, David, I like your talk about a technology policy, but I prefer you not use the phrase Cold War, because I think that has very specific meaning. And to link it To Bonnie's point, so Bonnie, I'm not going to argue with you about security. You're the leading expert. But I would just suggest that in Washington right now, there's this storyline that the economic relationship is hurting us. And therefore, if we pull back from the economic relationship, that's going to be good for us, and then it can have security implications. And I would argue the world's much more complicated. We get very powerful economic benefits from being integrated with China. So if we're really worried about the security to the point that we think we need to pull back, fine. We should just recognize that it has a very significant cost. It's not going to be a freebie.
I think that's actually a good thing to remember, is that I think for some in the administration and elsewhere, if the result of these talks is a decoupling, that might be considered a win. I don't think that's a unanimous opinion, but I think that note of caution about whether that's really possible or desirable is an interesting one. I want to pick up on your comments a little bit there about why China has an interest in making the deal in their economic slowdown, and talk a little bit about who might help us do the deal. Bonnie, I was looking at some of your comments in recent articles, and you were quoted alongside a professor from Peking University, I believe, who said, a number of the things that the U.S. is demanding are things we know we need to do ourselves, including allowing foreign investment and others. What do you see inside China? Sort of who are our partners whose hands we can strengthen? And I think we've tried to do that. I come from an agricultural trade perspective. Part of the reason we took a subsidies case against China was we knew there were people inside also saying, these corn subsidies are killing us environmentally, budget-wise, and we could strengthen their hand and get what we wanted. Do you see opportunities for that from the business community and others inside?
Well, I think that there's a lot of evidence of people in China, and especially Chinese economists, who say exactly what David said. Their economic model is sort of run its course, right? They need to make changes. Recognize that they have made commitments that they haven't completely followed through on. And there are many examples, from protecting intellectual property to joining the government procurement agreement, which is my favorite example, because when China joined the WTO, it said it would sort of join at the earliest possible opportunity, and Xi Jinping at Boao, last year said basically the exact same thing, and we've been listening to it for 18 years. So there's a lot of people in China who understand that there are things that China should do for its own interests and its own benefit. The question, though, then is, what should we or can we do to, as you say, maybe help sort of empower these people? And I think what I struggle with is that the China that I knew for so many years, and the people that I knew for so many years, who worked within the system, who exerted some influence, who were connected to decision making, are not really in the same position today. The structure, now I know the security group far better than the economists, so what Leoha and his connections are different than the people that I talk to on my subjects. But my guess is that there's some overlap of Xi Jinping saying things, making decisions that are completely a surprise to other people at very high levels in the system. So the right approach still, I think, has to be top-down in the Chinese system. We have to be engaging with Xi Jinping. People who work here, Chinese embassy, other people in China, they're always afraid to give the top guy bad news. Now that's even more so than it used to be. So we really have to be very directly telling Xi Jinping what the problems are, and then at the same time maybe trying to work with people in the system we certainly have to convince them. We're not asking them to do everything while we sit with our arms crossed and wait. This has to be a negotiation that serves both parties' interests, but the problems are they are more on their side. So yes, we should work with people in the system, but I'm very concerned about how decisions are being made in China today.
Interesting, and something to really keep in mind. David, I wanted to ask you a question. I think we've talked a little bit about what the landscape looks like in China and what might be palatable for reform. But I don't know that there's unanimity or how much fortitude we have on the U.S. side either. And was really struck by a comment from one of your recent columns saying that, the economic ascent of China has been a really profitable thing for multinational corporations here in the U.S. And in fact, some American companies have been happy to trade their know-how for access to almost 1.5 billion consumers because it has boosted their bottom line and has been consistent with the timeline of the average CEO or the expectations of the average shareholder. So how do you suggest maybe putting that relationship or the expectation for short-term business results, our business cycle concerns for wanting to see results in that time with what might be a longer-term challenge here? How do we keep that technology from being lost without taking ourselves out of a massive market? Or how do we calibrate that, knowing that it's hard to forego 1.5 billion customers?
Well, the great trade-off for the American tech industry has been to buy cheap silicon from China and establish software monopolies. Those are monopolies, natural monopolies in many cases. I'm not alleging some wicked conspiracy on the part of Google and Facebook and Microsoft by any means, but that's simply how it's worked out. That's why the 4 largest tech companies in the U.S. have a cash hoard of well over $600 billion, but yet we're not investing very much in critical technologies, which the Chinese now threaten to dominate, and which has caused us a great deal of anguish, as in the case of Huawei and 5G. So I think that has got to change. I think it's very much in the interest of the tech industry to take a more aggressive role and a more long-term view of America's technological position. For one thing, per Bonnie's comments, the critical weapon systems of the future are going to depend more on silicon than steel. They use smart chips, they use artificial intelligence, and if we can't produce the silicon at home, it would be like being a 19th century military power that can't produce its own cannon. That's an unacceptable situation from a national security standpoint. So I think the government really should be sitting down with the major tech companies and looking for solutions to these problems. From the American standpoint, the mantra has been capital light, use the least capital and the most brains, and that's been the best for share prices. We've had a fabulous share price boom as a result, but to some extent it's been a Faustian bargain, and it's left us without production capacity in critical areas. We could go on doing that. We could do on, and we'd end up like Britain, deindustrialized services economy, somewhat poor, and let China become the dominant world power. But I don't think if you asked Americans if they were comfortable with that outcome, you'd get too many yays. I think people would be very uncomfortable with that. And again, as you said, President Trump gets an enormous amount of credit for calling attention to the problem. I don't think yet he's found the right set of tools to accomplish the goals that he set out for himself.
Mm-hmm. So one last question, and I'll let any or all of you sort of take it, which is that I think we've had a discussion about the importance of the Chinese and the U.S. economies to this overall global economy, and I think we heard some comments at the end of the last panel about the continued need for U.S. leadership. But we've also heard some comments here that it's not just a U.S. and China game, and we may not have as much leverage as we thought we once did. So would be interested in your comments about what role you would like to see, or you think it is possible for our European or our Japanese colleagues, for example, to play to reinforce some of these messages that we think China needs to hear.
So let me lead off quickly on this one. As I think I hinted, I believe there's a tendency in Washington to exaggerate the impact of the economic problems we have with China. But for me, that doesn't diminish the importance of changing Chinese behavior. I think the most important reason to change Chinese behavior is that it's a threat to the global economic system. If a country that big violates various trade and investment norms, then that really opens up Pandora's box. So that's what makes the U.S. response especially unfortunate, because we have WTO non-compliant tariffs to try to change Chinese behavior. So now you have the two biggest economies in the world that are basically not following global rules. So I think that really creates serious risks. And that, Bonnie mentioned WTO reform. It's not going to be easy, but something like Trans-Pacific Partnership, that was a good effort to get like-minded countries to try to work together to strengthen the global system and to get China to play by global rules. So I think that, that's our best hope for preserving a prosperous global economy.
I completely agree with David. I don't know if there's, much more to add. I think it's, in some areas, our allies are stepping up in the absence of the United States doing the things that we should be doing. That's sort of good news. To some extent, I think, countries have left the United States to do what we wanted, and I don't really like the term free rider, but sort of that sort of concept. Now there's countries that say, well, if we really want to defend our interests, we actually have to step up and do more. We certainly see this more in the security realm, as well as in areas of who is proposing WTO reform. Right? It's not us. It's the EU, and so we have to find ways then, I hope, to come back to some of the agendas that they are putting forward, including TPP.
Great.
I think the Belt and Road Initiative is an important thing to mention in this context. Its importance so far has been exaggerated, a typical mixture of Chinese lack of foreign knowledge, arrogance, incompetence, and corruption has made the first round of investments much less effective than they'd like them to be. And there's a lot of frustration about that. But in the long term, China's objective is to sino-form the global South, to use Chinese technology, starting with mobile broadband, e-commerce, e-finance, and so forth, to transform many global South economies into little Chinas, which would be dependent on China. And if you go to the Huawei website, they've been talking about this since 2011. I sat in on pitches, hearing exactly this. Huawei is now building a mobile broadband system in Mexico right now. Some of this has been mentioned in the press, but not by the government, because the Mexicans are not going to be pushed around on this issue. And that's very disturbing to me, for China to be the dominant player in a market with billions of people. Japan has more foreign assets than China. I think an American-Japanese combination with some of our allies to counter the Belt and Road Initiative and offer a competitive product would be a critical part of our economic profile. Secretary Pompeo has talked about this and proposed a very small-scale initiative, but I think it's something that we should be doing on a much larger scale, something we really can't do by ourselves, but together with the Japanese, we probably could.
Very interesting. Thank you for that. I promised plenty of time for questions. We have about 17, 18 minutes left, so going to open it up for the audience.
So we'll have the mic runners, and as we talked about in the first panel, please identify yourself, your affiliation, and we play by the Jeopardy rules here, so please ask your question in the form of a question.
Don Phillips, Don Am Corporation consultant. I also work for the sugar industry, but this is not a sugar question. Is it possible that we're exaggerating the economic power of China in the longer term? I'm not an expert, but I hear all these things about, excessive debt, the aging problem, environmental problems, et cetera. So just like your views on that. Thank you.
Well, 2 points. The aging problem could be a devastating problem for China, but it's not something that we or our children will deal with. It's more our grandchildren. It's not going to affect them in a 20, 30-year horizon, 40, 50 years, surely, unless they have a demographic change. The debt problem, I think, is exaggerated. China's overall debt to GDP ratio is the same as that of the United States. The difference is they have very little consumer and central government debt and a huge amount of corporate debt. But the corporate debt really is government debt because it's state companies, state banks lending to state corporations, and it's overwhelmingly infrastructure. They don't have a highway trust. They don't have municipal bonds. They have infrastructure building state corporations which take on the debt. So that's not really a crisis. That's a management problem. In the meantime, they graduate 4 STEM BAs for every one of ours and 2 STEM PhDs. They work incredibly hard. It's a country full of ambition that has a sense that their moment has arrived. Huawei headquarters in Shenzhen, everyone's got a futon under their desk. And they take a half-hour nap after lunch because they're going to be there until 10 o'clock. And it's an employee-owned company. Go to China, it's like opening a window and getting a cold gale of air in your face, the amount of energy and determination there. So I don't think the threat is exaggerated. I think we can beat them. I think it's not that they can't innovate, but we innovate better. It's kind of a tortoise and hare thing. They're the tortoise, we're the hare, but we've been sleeping.
I think it's probably better to take more questions.
Great. I think there's one back here.
Hi, excuse me. My name is Joshua Brown. I'm with Nathan Associates. And so sort of piggybacking off of something that Ms. Glaser said earlier, I feel like what I'm going to say is a bit provocative, but I feel like it needs to be said. So would any of the people on the panel agree that it's at least somewhat hypocritical, the way that there's a narrative that somehow China is taking advantage of the West and the global trading system, or that China is playing unfairly, given the historical context of, say, the century of humiliation, where Western countries invaded China and stole millions of dollars worth of gold and silver from China, where they forced open Chinese ports through extraterritoriality, or where the British forced open China through the Opium Wars, and just how the liberal order that we understand it today does have historical roots in imperialism, colonialism, and the enslavement and genocide of numerous peoples around the globe. So isn't China somewhat right to challenge those norms?
I'm happy to take that one on first.
I'll follow you.
So lots of terrible things happened. I lived in China for 9 years, and I heard about the century of humiliation pretty much every day, okay? So lots of terrible things happened, but I view the post-war global order that was developed under U.S. leadership as a very important reaction to that, right? So America deserves a lot of credit. I mean, we've set up this extraordinary free trade regime in the world that's enabled developing countries to benefit the way they've never have before. So one of the striking things in the global economy is for the last 25 years, developing countries have been growing faster than rich countries. And you're also used to that now. You don't realize that 25 years ago, a lot of economics was focused on how is it that developing countries can't grow and how come poverty keeps increasing. And now we've had this extraordinary decrease in poverty in the world over the last 25 years. So frankly, the global, call it whatever you want, globalization with multinational companies, free trade, the development institutions, et cetera, this has all been a tremendous boon for the world. So we just have a much better world than used to exist. China's benefited more than anybody else. They've had this extraordinary poverty reduction. So it's reasonable for us to ask China to be a good supporter. And I've been in meetings with Xi Jinping where he starts the meeting by saying China supports the global economic institution set up by the United States after World War II. We hear this all the time. And then we can question, are they supporting it enough? Is that totally sincere? But I think kind of questioning the value of this system, the empirical evidence just really runs against that.
So I was also going to say China's benefited more from the internet post-World War II international order than any other country in the world. They don't call it the liberal international order because they've embraced the institutions, not the values, and certainly oppose U.S. alliances. And I think that's our definition of the international order. So the Chinese really define it differently. I have to say that China doesn't have a sort of patent on having been have suffered at the hands of imperialists, and China wasn't a colony. So there are many other stories and many other countries that could tell a better story, if you will, about having really suffered that were colonized. So China's story is in my view, the fact that they keep bringing this up every day that you live there until today is a deliberate effort to continue to forge national unity in support of the Communist Party. And I look forward to the day when China can stop looking backwards and talk about its sordid history and talk more about the promises of the future. If we look at the areas that China's trying to change in the international order, we should be worried. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't make adjustments. There's nothing perfect about this international order. We could start dissecting areas that should be fixed, including the WTO. But the areas where China is working assiduously to make some changes, like the Human Rights Council, where we have withdrawn from. There is little opportunity right now for us to be pushing back, but China trying to convince the international community of its own definition of human rights. If you look at internet governance, and cyber, where there are no real norms, and China, alongside Russia and some other countries, are trying to create norms that we want freedom and access of information. We want the internet to be open. We know what China's views on that are. So it's not just the question of should we support China's efforts to make adjustments, but what kinds of adjustments are they willing to make? And if it's going to be standing up a new Asian infrastructure investment bank, that may present some opportunities. And, I would be the first to say I think that the United States made the wrong decision at the time in discouraging other countries from joining, and I think we should have joined. So the question is where and what those changes are, and I am concerned about some of the changes that they're trying to make.
Take another questions here and here.
Thanks so much, Deanna Oken, Adusi Mastriani, and Schomburg. And I guess I'll direct my question to you, Mr. Goldman, but others might have a comment. You focused a lot on technology, and I would agree with many of the things you said. But I guess I was wondering if you could expound on what you think the win is for the U.S., because as you said, the U.S. has innovated better. We are the hare. We still have companies, big R&D companies like Qualcomm, who are actually still winning the race with Huawei on the 5G backbone. So I was curious as to what you think we can do, as opposed to, it sounded a little bit like you're saying, like, we have to beat the Chinese at their own game of, like, spending all this money, whereas the reason I think we've been successful on the innovation side, not discounting the role of DARPA at all, but of having companies with strong IP protection who have brought innovation to the world, and that's what the Chinese want. So I think we have a lot of what they want. We don't want to give it to them. We don't want to have forced technology transfer. But I just wondered if there are other specific things that you have in mind when you talk about how we keep that edge.
Well, I'm an old Cold Warrior, and I go back to the Reagan administration, where, as I mentioned, we spent nearly 1.5 points of GDP on basic R&D, and General Electric, RCA, Bell Labs, IBM, Hughes, many other corporations had laboratories of thousands of engineers. They'd get contracts in the U.S. government. Some engineer would figure out how to do something, quit, start their own company. That's how most of the great tech companies got started. That effort has pretty much shriveled relative to what it used to be. Our STEM education is way behind. Our scores in STEM at all levels are way behind. 80% of our graduate students, roughly, in STEM fields are foreign. And that leaves us open to leapfrogging by competitors, whom China is by far the largest. And I find that I don't think that's an acceptable situation. If we keep going that way, we end up being much more like Britain, being a services provider and being poorer. So my view may be colored by my Cold War view. And when I say Cold War, I mean we need to fight it as if it were a Cold War, hopefully not have a Cold War. That's what we're best at, combination of government subsidizing basic research and private enterprise taking the risk of commercialization. There's a bright line. I don't think we should have an Asian policy because if we tried, we'd do it wrong. We're just not capable of it as a society. But there are things we've done in the past. I'd like to just do exactly what we did in the past, do it again and better.
Bill Lane again. My question is actually for Darci, as a true agricultural expert. There's two prevailing views on trade wars. One is they're easy to win. The other is there's no winners. But one thing that's sort of in between is there really are winners, and those are the ones that are not involved in the trade war. And traditionally what we've seen are the uninvolved try to take over your market once you become labeled as an unreliable supplier. What is happening in the ag world, and how long will it take to recover with the tariffs and restrictions from soybeans to pork to what have you? Is there any examples you can cite? Is this something that immediately will return to normal, or will American firms be tainted as an unreliable supplier for a long period of time?
Well, thanks, Bill. I didn't know you were going to put me on the spot. I might not have called on you. Certainly, I would say a couple of things. From an agricultural perspective, the position that we've staked out on trade is really concerning. And for a couple of reasons, in that I think our conversation with China has really focused on a concern for those industries that are worried about competing with imports. But really the entire U.S. ag business model has been that other countries need to eat our surplus. And that it's focused on exports. And so talk of more of an industrial policy or focused on bringing some of that production and using that production at home, we've pretty much maxed that out. We can't eat what U.S. agriculture produces. And so I think it's an entire sector that's really not being talked about, but is paying a pretty heavy price for this policy. And the political positioning of agriculture, both domestically in countries where food production is very tied to identity and national security and peace in the countryside, it's a tempting lever to pull to retaliate in that sector. But it's also an easy one to pull if you want the United States to take notice, because 20% of farmer income is directly generated by those exports, and in global commodity markets, when they don't have a place to go, farmers feel that pain pretty quickly. And for quite some time now, a number of other countries have been working very hard to be as efficient, to produce with as good a quality, and to really modernize, diversify, and add value to their ag products in a way that we are just not sitting in the same place we were 10 or certainly 20 years ago in terms of being the first, the supplier of choice. And we've maintained that role as supplier of choice in some ways because we've been so reliable, because we didn't play with our border policy, because we were consistent and transparent and had good logistics. And when we start casting some of those things in doubt, we give our customers a reason to look elsewhere. And it's not clear to me that we get that market share back. even in countries like Mexico, where that period of doubt may be short-lived. I often think back to a speech by the economy minister, by Secretary Guajardo, saying, if NAFTA taught us anything, or if this renegotiation taught us anything, it's that we had too many eggs in one basket. And that's actually not a good risk management strategy to rely so heavily on supplies of things that our agricultural markets need, whether that's our feed grains for our livestock industry, or that our people need to eat from one supplier. And so I think it will take a long time, and I'm not sure we ever will fully get back to the place that we were. And I think U.S. agriculture has somewhat taken for granted that people understood how much we appreciate and want to be part of that global economy, and that we are in it for the long haul. But frankly, I don't think it hurts for our industry to be very deliberate about talking to our customers about the fact that we see ourselves as very much a part of the global economy, because I'm not sure that's the message that they're receiving overall. So we have 1 minute left. I'm gonna try and end where we started. So David kicked us off by saying what he thought victory should look like in very specific terms of what should be in a package coming out of this latest round of negotiations. Perhaps each of the three of you could tell us what you think will be, given current pressures, whether from Huawei or the stock market, et cetera. Where do you think we end up at the end of this week, and where do you think we end up on March 1?
Right, so I think at the end of the week, we'll probably get some fairly bland statements suggesting that talks are going well and there are a lot more details. I don't think they can hammer it out in the next few days. I think by the end of the deadline, which is March 2nd, the most likely scenario is they announce some kind of deal that has some of the elements I discussed. The key question for me is will the U.S. pull back all of the current tariffs for that deal, or will the U.S. try to keep some of those in place, and can President Xi Jinping accept that kind of deal? So I think there is a lot of uncertainty, and it's always possible that things will fall apart and that we won't get any kind of trade deal this year.
I'm not only sandwiched between the two Davids, but between the two trade experts. So I don't think things will fall apart at this particular juncture. I do think that there's going to be more of a focus on what the Chinese are purchasing, with a few other things that we are working on, so there will be some positive statements. I see a good possibility at the end of the 90 days that they extend that deadline, maybe reset it at another point, maybe another 90 days. I think that with the increasing domestic problems that our president faces and the challenges from Congress, we have seen this in our country before, that there is a reason for the president to start looking to foreign policy for some wins. We have at the end of February possible talks with the North Koreans, where I think he is looking for a win there, and I think China is another area where he is looking for a win. So I think the odds of this coming apart in the near term are not great, but I don't rule out that they come apart later on if there isn't follow-through. And I do think that Lighthizer focus is on putting in place mechanisms for compliance, and I think that is important. So I think we'll see some sort of small progress now, but the real question is looking out longer term and whether what we are in the process of creating is going to hold and whether it will make a difference.
In general, I agree with Bonnie and David. I don't think we're going to get a comprehensive agreement by March 1st, but I think by the end of the second half of the year, China will give President Trump what looks like a major victory that he can take to the polls in terms of creating American jobs, protecting American technology, and so forth. I think it's very much in China's interest to make this annoying barbarian on their borders go away by giving him a lot of tribute and preparing to settle accounts much later. There's only one person in this administration whose opinion matters, and that's the president's. It's not really a cabinet administration. It's a personal administration, really unlike anything that we've had. I mean, not even Franklin Roosevelt was quite like this. So I think too much attention is paid to gaming the opinions inside the administration between, say, Lighthizer and Mnuchin and so forth. I think President Trump needs a win, as Bonnie said. I think the Chinese will get it to him, and that's going to be good for the world economy. On balance, that's going to be good for the stock market.
Excellent. Well, thank you for those thoughts. A really interesting and provocative discussion. And all of you, please join me in thanking our panel.